In this video, I'm going to show you how to use balance lines to fit your pants pattern. I'm Katrina from KatrinaKCreations.com, and if you don't know a lot about balance lines or how to use them as a guide to fit your pants pattern, I'm going to answer 3 questions in this video. Question 1, what are balance lines? Question 2, how do you mark the balance lines on your pants pattern? And question 3, how do you use the balance lines when fitting your muslin or your test garment? Let's get started. So, dealing with question 1, what are balance lines? Balance lines are both horizontal and vertical lines on your pattern piece that you can use as a guide while fitting your garment. These lines help you to see how the garment is hanging on the body. Now, of course, you're not going to just depend on these lines. You're also going to go by how the garment feels. Especially in a pair of pants, you're going to sit down, you're going to stand up, move around, and that also will guide you into how your garment is fitting. But balance lines are just a visual guide to show you how your garment is hanging on your body. The balance lines for your pants pattern that I'll be talking about in this video are your grain line, hip line, crotch line, and knee line. Now, most pattern companies will not put these lines on the pattern pieces for you, which is fine because it's easy for you to do it yourself. And that brings us to question number 2. How do you mark the balance lines on your pants pattern? The way you determine where your hip line should be placed, if you don't want to use what your pattern suggests, is to tie a knot in a piece of elastic and then step into it and pull it up like you would be pulling up a pair of pants. But pull that piece of elastic up to the fullest part of your hip and make sure that elastic is level as it goes around your body. Now, this is just to give you an idea what I'm talking about when I refer to the fullest part of your hip, because everyone's hip or butt shape is different. The fullest part of this hip is kind of easy to see because of the shape, but if your butt is flat, the fullest part is not so obvious. So in that case, my suggestion is to consider the area right before the butt cheek starts to curve back into the leg as the fullest part of your hip. But again, this is only a suggestion because it really depends on your unique curves. You could also take 2 or 3 measurements in the area that you think is the fullest part and choose the greater number, because it's always easier to make a garment smaller than it is to make it bigger. That way, if you have to alter it, it's going to be far easier to take it in than to let it out. Then once the fullest part of your hip is established, you're going to measure from your waist to that piece of elastic right along your side seam, or where your side seam would be. And you're going to do the same for the knee length, where measure from your waist down to your knee right along your side seam. Now you can take your measurements and mark them on your pattern pieces. So on both the front and back pieces, you want to draw in your stitching line at your side seam. And as I've already done here, mark the placement for your hip line and your knee line directly on your stitching line. Now don't worry, I didn't forget about the crotch line, but we really didn't have to measure for that, and you'll see why later. Now keep in mind, when we draw in the lines, we use our grain line as a reference line. So the grain line that is already on your pattern, that's what you're going to line your ruler up with, and also with your placement mark to draw in your hip, your crotch, and your knee lines. That means that all of these lines have to be perpendicular to your grain line. This is very important. Draw your hip line all the way across the piece using your placement mark as a guide, and of course using your grain line as a reference. And don't forget to label your lines to eliminate any confusion later on. Now for the crotch line, we're going to start where the crotch and the inseam intersect or connect. That point is where we're going to draw in our crotch line. And remember, we're working on the stitching line, not the cutting line. Then we're going to go where our placement is for our knee line, using our grain line as a reference, and draw that line also all the way across the piece. And before going to the back piece, label your lines. You also want to finish drawing your grain line down to the hem and up to the waist. My grain line goes into one of my darts. If yours does the same, then you can stop the grain line right at the point of your dart. Usually I use pencil. Right now I'm using a Sharpie to make sure you can see the lines on camera. Now it's time to put our balance lines on our back piece. So take your front piece and place it over your back piece at the side seam. Starting from the hem, match your side seam, and when you get to a balance line, mark it on the stitching line of your back piece with your tracing wheel. As you get past the knee line, your seams may not match exactly, so you need to walk your front piece along the back piece until you get to your crotch line and your hip line. Once the placement of all your back lines is marked on the back piece, draw them in and remember to use the back grain line as a reference so all the horizontal lines are perpendicular to the grain line. You probably won't have to do this, but just in case you've self-drafted your pattern as I have here, you're going to have to add your notches on your pattern pieces as well. You're now ready to cut out your pattern pieces. And once your pattern pieces are cut out, you can mark all your lines and darts and any other markings that you need. Mark all of your darts, and for pants, I like to mark the stitching line of the crotch seam for easier sewing. All these are marked on the wrong side of the fabric. Then make sure you mark all of your balance lines, including the grain line, on the right side of the fabric. I also mark the stitching line of the waist on the right side of the fabric so I can see it while fitting. This is what the pieces look like when the pattern is removed, and I know this is a little light on camera, so I went over my lines with a dark pen so you can see them better. We are now ready to sew. And after everything is sewn, that brings us to question 3, and that is, how do you use balance lines when fitting your muslin or test garment? And before I show you the finished muslin you just saw me working on, I want to go back to the first muslin I did for this basic pants pattern. Then I'll show you the latest one. So here's the first muslin on the form. They're too big, so I've pinned out the excess at the side seams. The balance lines look good in the front, and don't worry if they're hard to see because it's the back hip line I really want you to see. So looking at the hip line, which is the line that's darker than all the others, they look good on the front, but as we go to the back, they go to a point at the crotch seam. And this is telling me that the crotch needs to be lengthened. Now, I don't need to add any length between the waist and the hip. Actually, that could be shortened a little. So the length needs to be added below the hip line. And this is also a benefit of having the balance lines so that it kind of pinpoints where your fitting problem is. And to give you a better visual of what I'm talking about, the tape measure is level, but you can see my back hip lines are not level at the crotch seam. After doing a quick alteration where I lengthened the crotch seam between the crotch line and the inseam, this is what the finished alteration looked like. And the pink paper is the amount that I added. I'm working on a half scale form, so it doesn't look like much, but of course for a full size pants pattern, it would be quite a bit. I also did a few other alterations. Now this is the muslin you saw me mark and cut earlier in this video. So here's what you're looking for when you try on your muslin. First of all, how does it feel? You of course want your pants to be comfortable. So sit down in them, make sure they're comfortable and not too tight when sitting. Then standing up, look at your balance lines. Is the grain line, which is your only vertical line, going straight down the leg, or is it going off to the side? If it's going off to the side, either side, something's wrong. It could be the balance of your pattern piece is off, or just that the grain line is off, maybe after you've done an alteration or two. Are your lines, like your hip line, your knee line, your crotch line, are they in the right place? For example, is the hip line at the fullest part of your hip? If it isn't, does the line need to be moved? Or do you need to lengthen or shorten your pattern between the waist and the hip line? Looking at the side view of this muslin for this form, I can see the hip line is in the right place. The one thing I don't like on the side is the way my lines go to a slight point at the side seam. So I'll definitely check the side seam balance of my front and back pattern pieces. This could be me being a perfectionist, which I'm definitely trying to work on, but it also could mean that there's something going on with my pattern. So I'm going to double check and make sure. And let's look at the back, because that's where the problem was, at the back hip line. Remember, my back hip line came to a point at the crotch seam. So I lengthened the back crotch seam below the hip line. Now this is definitely much better. I do think I need to add a little more, and I had to do the same alteration on my pants pattern, and I could feel that I needed more length in the crotch seam. So that's why the balance lines and how the pants feel on your body go hand in hand. I also have to adjust the back waist because it's a little too big. So I've pinned out the back outside dart to determine how much I need to subtract. But when I actually make the alteration, I'll probably take in even amount from both darts. And looking at the back grain line, remember the grain line has to go over the curve of the butt, so it's not going to look as straight as the front. I could have placed my grain line in the center of the pant leg, which I'll do in the future. But overall, this fit is not bad. I hope this video gives you a better understanding of balance lines and how to use them in your fittings. And if you want to draft your own pants pattern to fit your curves, sign up at the link in my description or in the pinned comment. You'll be the first to know when my new pants drafting course is released, where I'll teach you how to not only draft and fit your own pants pattern, but also how to use it to create an infinite number of pant styles that you know will fit. Thanks for watching.